now you just have this sort of factory that's just building out automations, and that's good. I can't stress that enough. If you don't have a good process, you will not have good automation. That's just the reality of things. And then, making sure you understand what manual workflows are out there and have a method to understand those within the business, and I continuously identify them. Make automation part of a project to build new things as opposed to an afterthought.
Hey everyone, Tanya Terrell here, and welcome back to Between Fires and Futures. Today's guest is someone I've been especially excited to sit down with, not only because of what he does now, but because of the journey that brought him here. Chris Miller is the Chief Technology Officer at Advizex, where he helps enterprise teams cut through complexity and operationalize modern technology. But his path to the CTO seat wasn't a straight shot, and it was built through decades of hands-on experience in customer environments, pre-sales architecture, consulting, and technical leadership. He learned to program at 6, founded an internet service provider at 19, spent nearly a decade in financial services, and for the past 14 years at Advizex, he's worn nearly every technical hat, building deep insight into how IT organizations actually work. He's one of VMware's elite VCDX certified architects and a true systems thinker with a DevOps mindset. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tanya.
It's great to have you here. I'm, really excited to dive into this topic. So we're in a moment where automation is getting a lot of buzz, but most IT leaders are still stuck putting out fires. So I'm glad to have your perspective on how we shift from reaction to intention. But first, I've got to start with something from your bio that you sent over last night, because it really just jumped out at me. You learned to program at 6 and launched an ISP by 19, like not exactly the standard path to CTO. How did those I really want to hear about that. I'm just so curious. And how did those early experiences shape the way you approach technology and leadership today?
Yeah, that's great. So when I was 4, my parents bought a Commodore 64, which is dating me a bit, mostly just to play games. And I learned to read around 4.5 from a cousin before I went into school. And my father had a basic programming book that he had purchased with the Commodore 64. And so I just started reading it. And there were some example programs in there, and I wrote a few of them, right, just by copying them, but then sort of intuitively figured out how to change things around a bit. And so I think there was a little basic demonstration program about guessing the correct number for a thing. And I had tweaked that and did it to mess with my parents a bit, called them down and said, hey, I built a program, run this. And, they picked the wrong number, and the screen filled up with characters and created in this loop and crashed it out. And they thought that was pretty amazing, but I was intrigued by it. It was, to be honest, it wasn't, I didn't have a whole solid foundation of principles for programming or anything, but I was able to understand the concept of variables and how things work. But that really is what kind of sparked my interest in technology moving forward. And then, the ISP thing in 19 was something I really wanted to do, because my first job in tech was actually with an internet service provider in the town where I lived. And I got that job not because I was looking for it. They had an issue and it was affecting me. I would dial in sometimes and I would get really poor performance. And I spent a lot of time just reading internet channels and chat channels, IRC back in the day, that talked about technology and how it worked. And I learned a lot about how the internet worked just watching people ask questions and answer them. And so I reached out to the ISP support team and said, hey, I've got this problem. Every time I dial in, I get this one IP address. Are you associating that IP address to a modem, a specific phone line? And they said, well, yeah, we are. I said, well, here it is. This is one I'm having a problem with. And about a week later, the owner called me and said, hey, I want to let you know we fixed the problem. We'd been searching for it for 6 months. We had the phone company out here 2 or 3 times. They couldn't figure out what was going on. Nobody had thought to pinpoint, which specific modem the problem was. And you did. So you want a job? I said, wow. Sure, I'll come in and talk about it. Right. So ostensibly it was to do tech support. But my first day on the job, I was being taught how to build PCs, and I was thrown into a corporate environment and said, go fix this network printer. And I had no idea what a network printer was. I didn't know that you could just plug one into a network, right? So, but I figured it out pretty quickly. And doing that 2 or 3 times, I got to realize, like, technology, it's important to have knowledge, but I think it's more important to be able to adapt and learn things quickly, because it changes so frequently. Your knowledge you have today is not useless, but not as useful within a week. And it seemed like I was really good at that. So that was what kind of drove things forward. And then after a couple of years of working in that ISP and understanding how it worked, I saw ways to make it far more efficient and valuable for customers and decided to branch out on my own and do the same. But that's what kind of spearheaded the whole thing. And to this day, I have a love for, especially where business and technology meet, right? Because I think technology can do some wonderful things for businesses and individuals in general, but being able to help people realize value from the technology is what I live for.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story. So let's fast forward to today. Enterprise tech's gotten way more complex, and I feel like it's getting more and more complex all the time. But that builder mindset you've carried from the beginning really seems more relevant than ever, right? So that kind of hands-on systems thinking experience gives you probably a rare perspective on how IT really works behind the scenes. Where are you seeing the most day-to-day pressure hit IT teams right now? And where is automation solving problems that used to eat up time and resources?
Yeah, it's going to sound a little bit probably trite, but I mean, the truth is IT is still dealing with the problem of, move faster with less. Organizations are still under pressure, obviously, in our system to grow profitability, reduce, hiring, improve overall operating efficiencies. And tools in the IT world are being built to make things more efficient and effective for people. So a lot of organizations will say, pick up more workload and continue doing what you're doing. So in the role of an IT customer, it's really kind of hard. You're constantly context switching, right? You'll be in a meeting talking about a project that you're working on. You'll leave that to go solve a critical issue that popped up out of nowhere. You'll spend 6 hours of your day on that. You'll fall behind on your projects. You'll try to play catch up, right? And you're constantly juggling this support versus project builds. And if you're fortunate enough to be in a larger organization where those roles are separated and focused, it's not as bad. But most organizations aren't in a position to do that. So, that's one, obviously, is do more with less, right? Yeah. The other one is just in general having to provision more resources, build new systems, and more complex and integrated systems, right? So a common pattern for an application in the past would be, one or two little servers that maybe talk to each other and do a thing. You make some VMs or before that, even physical systems, you tie them together, you're off to the races. And now we're seeing applications that are pulling in data from sources that are sometimes in your data center, sometimes with a partner, sometimes in a cloud. Some of the services are being distributed, especially in larger organizations, to get closer to the end users. And so an application might have, multiple tiers where it didn't before. It's distributed where it wasn't before, and it's hybrid, right? We've got part of it running in the cloud, part of it running on premise. And that produces all sorts of challenges with, skills, provisioning, security, and so on. So those I still see that being the biggest challenge for folks, right? The software vendors don't always tell you in great detail what you need to make their application work. They give you some general requirements, and then you spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. And so where automation kind of helps solve a lot of those problems is it takes those repetitive things off the table, right? So if you're trying to deploy a new system and you're in the process of tuning it and testing it, you have to rebuild it a few times, right? Doing that by hand isn't always the best way of doing it. The other thing, and this I think is more important, where a lot of folks see automation as a speed mechanism, right? How to deploy faster. I can press a button, it just happens. Mm-hmm. And that isn't always the greatest benefit. I mean, people can do a lot of things quickly in IT, especially when you've done them 100 times. But consistency is key, right? So as these systems become more complex to deploy and the standards behind them to get them prepared become more complex, you start to see your build checklist growing and growing over time, especially when you include security and things like that. And most IT people don't pull up the document and go step by step through its checklist, right? They do it a few times, they remember it, and then it's automatic. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is when the process changes, there's new tools that you need to put in place, right? Often you'll forget to do that. You'll skip the step where you integrated the backup system, whatever. Automation solves it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So automation takes that off the table. If it's either going to do it right all the time or it's going to do it wrong all the time. And the minute you do see it do something wrong, you can correct that and fix it for everything. So that's one. Obviously, the smarter, working with less, work smarter, not harder. It's going to contribute to that. And then as systems become more complex and things become more complicated to troubleshoot, automation can also help in that area as well, right? If you're spending less time having to go provision and do stand-ups of projects, and you have automation in place that will, respond to security events or respond to an infrastructure performance issue so that you're not being pulled away from what you're working on to go solve those problems, then it's going to give you more time to focus on bringing value to the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in your experience, what are the highest leverage use cases where automation is actually moving the needle for IT teams?
Yeah, so we see a lot in a couple of areas. Right? One, I will say moving the needle that's most apparent to IT would be kind of the self-healing operational automation stuff. And a good example of this would be I have a system, it grows over time. I give it a certain amount of storage. Eventually that fills up. I need to either clean things and shrink that storage or add more, right? And that's a manual process. But if you can respond to events like that in your environment where, something grows, you give it the space it needs, you fire off a job to optimize it and put guardrails around that, right? That allows instantaneous change within the environment. It also is proactive in preventing issues that would arise if, say, the storage filled up and you couldn't write anymore. So that's one we see. That's also one of the harder things for people to do from an automation perspective, because there's a significant amount of integrations and unique scenarios that can occur. And unless you have the right tools in place to observe how often issues occur, how frequently they occur, right, it's hard for you to judge which of those things you should automate first. Another area is just provisioning, and although that's not hard for most people, the decommissioning is. So we see people deploy systems all the time and then they kind of live forever. And then when it comes time to tear them all down in a proper way, that's usually not a well-defined process, right? Whereas in automation, you automate a provisioning of a system, you can automate the exact reverse of that to decommission it. So that stand up and shut down are two common use cases that we see that bring a lot of value back to folks, especially if they grow the environment and they have more system deployment requests coming in. They don't have to spend a whole lot of time to service those. The third one is, I think, I'm surprised, honestly, to see this is the least amount of automation that I see, but I think has probably some of the most value for an organization is security response automation or security SOAR platforms, right? Mm-hmm. So if you see, for example, somebody's trying to log into an administrative account from overseas multiple times, rather than figure that out when you're going through logs 4 days later, right? Your system notices that and automatically shuts that person off, blocks them, and notifies somebody, right? As an example. But being able to respond immediately to a security threat is immensely valuable for an organization.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. So where would an IT leader get started with each of those scenarios?
Yeah, so this is where we see the biggest struggle. And in my view, where you get started is you got to take a kind of look at every process that you have in your organization and determine where's the value. If I automate this thing, how much time am I going to save? How much is that going to free up to give time back to my people? You look at the errors. How often do I have to re-provision something because the request was wrong or I clicked the wrong button? And surprisingly, that's frequent. And then you kind of map out all those processes and say, okay, this one would be easy to automate and we're going to save a whole bunch of time. The challenge we see is a lot of processes aren't clearly defined. Provisioning processes are generally pretty clearly defined within teams, but not necessarily across teams. And a lot of times people say we want to automate everything, but they don't know necessarily what they want to automate. They haven't thought of a process, right? So automation works against processes. And if you don't have a well-defined process, you will not have a well-defined automation scheme to go behind it. So that I would start with identifying all the processes that are out there and then perform an exercise to analyze those and figure out which ones give you the best bang for the buck. We do this with our customers. We created something years ago we call our lean value analysis for automation use cases. So we'll work with customers to identify those processes, map out the processes that we want to consider for automation, and then we factor in the cost of employee time for the work time that they put there. We factor in the wait time, right? Because when you think about automation across teams in like a provisioning process, the request comes in somewhere, somebody picks that up, does something with it, gets passed on to another team to provision a certain element. It gets passed on to another team to secure it. It gets passed on to another team to back it up. And each of those teams doing their individual tasks, the tasks don't take long to complete. They click a few buttons, are done. It's the waiting between, right? So if I get my job done and I pass that on to the next team and the person who does it's on vacation for 3 days, right? That whole process for deployment stalls for 3 days. So we'll see very commonly it takes 30 days for a customer to deploy a new system. Most of that 30 days is just waiting for the next team to do their thing. And so if we can identify that by, again, mapping out the process, who's involved, who does what, in what sequence, which inputs need to get from one piece of the step to the next step and so on. we can start to figure out how much time on average is being spent just waiting and eliminate that as well with automation. So that is where I would definitely start. The second thing you can do is we see a lot of, I'll call it shadow automation, right? Similar to shadow IT, but there's a lot of folks that automate their own tasks. They don't tell anybody. Ran into one customer, employee left, went through the files. They were working on 1,000+ scripts in a folder somewhere no one knew about. That did a significant amount of automation. It was great. Yeah. But then reverse engineering that and trying to figure out how they did it and all that is complicated. It takes a lot of time. So figure out what's out there now so that you can get ahead of that. Also, because you can reuse what you already have if you're going to do a more broad orchestration type of project where, again, you're automating different tasks across teams. You're going to orchestrate that workflow. Take what you have and use it instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. It'll save you time and get you to the end state quicker. So those are two good ways to start. And then the other thing that I would look at as well is, is speed and shrinking that process time the only value? Because we find most of the time is what people want automation for is consistency, so that they know every single system they deploy meets all of their corporate standards and requirements. Every step along the way was executed without having to rely on somebody missing a thing. So they forgot to click a button or whatever. And that consistency is good because if you build consistently deployed systems that look and feel the same across the board, meet your standards, a lot less troubleshooting needs to happen, right? You didn't forget to put the AV software package or update it and create a vulnerability, or you forgot to back something up and now we can't restore it. So having all of that done for you in a consistent way often provides more value from a senior leadership perspective than even, speeding up the process.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think, everybody understands automation is really a strategic imperative, but even when everyone agrees that it matters, we still see initiatives stall. Tools are there, maybe even the buy-in is there or seems there, but why do so many teams still find themselves stalled out?
It depends on the size of the company. I've seen in the enterprise space in particular, it's difficulty in figuring out who owns overall automation for the organization because everybody has their own sort of stake in it and their own ideas about what they want to do. Overlapping tools and just the sheer number of tools that are out there that people can use is often difficult, right? Skilling up. Infrastructure people generally aren't developers. They don't, some of them can script. A lot of them are good at it, but they don't think like a developer and think how to build a system out like an application. So you have varying levels of skills and some people are really good at certain parts of it. Some aren't. So you have to kind of get around the same page, different standards. People have different preferences and what kind of script languages they use, that sort of thing. Right. And so trying to organize all that and bring it together is often difficult for people. And so in the enterprise space, we would generally recommend kind of breaking things out into more functional teams and, let people who own responsibility, say for infrastructure versus applications, have their own tools that can automate those things to the best of their ability, right? Tools they're comfortable with that can automate their task and have the best feature set. And then you bring in a master orchestrator kind of above all that. Then you bring a team in that manages that piece of it and you integrate all the tools. So in a big process, right, like I mentioned earlier in provisioning, you have the system deployment, maybe the backup and security deployment. Maybe each of those have different tools. A lot of the security tools will push out updates on their own and things, but you leverage orchestration to instantiate that through, an API call or something as part of your orchestrated workflow. And that brings it all together. And then people can manage their own tools that are more effective. But again, that can be a challenge because you might have different tools that don't all integrate very well. And that can get costly if you have too many of them. So that's been a challenge. The other one I think we see a lot happen is people treat it like a project, automation like a project, instead of treating it like a lifestyle, if you will, right?
Yeah.
So they build out a big automated platform and it works, and then they go on and do other things and they never maintain it, right?
Yeah,
so
it can't be one and done.
Yeah, you have to. It's an ongoing thing. You're always automating something, and there's always going to be new things to automate. And then the third thing is fundamental architectural shifts often will disrupt automation. We'll see a lot of customers who are either cloud first or heavy in the cloud are very good at automation because those platforms are built for that and software defined by default. But if you're on-premise and you build out a nice on-premise automation system that works for that, and then you start building in the cloud, oftentimes those on-premise systems don't integrate as effectively in the cloud, or you just have a different way of doing things in the cloud that maybe you don't automate the same process or the processes aren't built yet. And that's when it starts to fall apart a bit because you start to see a divergence between the way teams are managing as platforms. And then finally, if you have to kind of think through how you want to do it. There's always a trade-off between build versus buy. There are a lot of platforms you can buy that will integrate into the systems you have on premise and do a great job automating those, especially with out-of-box workflows that most customers use. But then there's some that don't have those capabilities, right? And you need to build them, or there's a reason you want to custom build your own platform to differentiate you. And you have to kind of figure out what's the best way to do that. If you lead too heavily on buy, a lot of times that'll create budget constraints and cost overrun issues for folks. So you have to figure out the right tool for the job and constantly leverage that against what's the return you're going to get in terms of operational efficiency and cost reduction, and compare that to the cost of the tool.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it's really important that, IT leaders are aware of the hidden blockers, whether tech or even culturally or operationally, that get in the way. So will you take me through, what does smart, scalable automation actually look like when it's done right? Either from a tooling perspective or even talking about like leadership or workflow point of view.
Yeah. So, the very first thing is, you likely won't succeed unless you have buy-in at the leadership level.
Yeah.
Even if you were automating everything with free open source software, there's time investment that needs to happen from each team that's involved in automation. You need strong leadership that can kind of bring all those teams together, identify again all those workflows that touch multiple teams, and take the right approach to prioritizing what you're going to automate. Without leadership buy-in, it will fail because your priorities will constantly you'll be pulled in other directions and you won't have time to do it. Where we see strong leadership buy-in is where we see the most success. That's kind of step number one. If you're a large enough organization and you can afford to do this, having a dedicated automation team is something else we see that's been helpful for folks to have long-term success. And again, that's because you're trying to automate as a way of life as opposed to a project. And if you've got a dedicated team that the business units and the IT teams can go to and say, hey, I've got this process, I need it to be automated, that team understands how to analyze that, how to prioritize it, importantly, how to get it done. Now you just have this sort of factory that's just building out automations, and that's good. Again, the process definition thing, I can't stress that enough. If you don't have a good process, you will not have good automation. That's just the reality of things. And then, making sure you understand what manual workflows are out there and have a method to understand those within the business and I continuously identify them. Make automation part of a project to build new things as opposed to an afterthought. Mm-hmm. And, more recently is, I think, where it's going to get interesting is with the Agentic AI mm-hmm. and being able to leverage that into the automation process, because now it's not just a matter of, looking at a request form and then taking some action on it. But there are much more higher level business processes that touch IT but aren't 100% IT that can be automated in an intelligent way with Agentic AI, especially when you have a language model that's able to interpret, non-standardized information in form of documents and things that you might need as part of that automated process. So if you've got those things in place, if you've got the strong leadership, you've got a team, especially, you have a good grip on your processes, you know where you need to start and what's going to bring you the most value, and you know how to use AI to enhance it, that's where we start to see the best return from a scalable automation perspective.
Yeah. Can you share maybe what some of your customers are doing with automation and Agentic AI?
Yeah, so we're still at the very front end of that. We have one customer project working on right now, very large company that has multiple departments that today have just processes that, flow from procurement to finance to marketing and so on. And it's a lot of, human beings interpreting documents, looking at policy, seeing if the thing in the document matches the thing in the policy, creating some kind of write-up in response in that. And so we're in the process now of kind of consulting with each of the business units, the departments within that organization to understand what their day-to-day workflow looks like, what people are doing, especially around document-related things, reading, consuming, altering documents, producing documents, and then how that interacts with the various departments. So that's kind of phase one of that. And we're well along the way. And then phase two is then starting to build out the AI assistants for each of those departments to allow AI to come into the process and take over some of that with human beings still in the loop, right? We're not at the point where we're just going to turn it over to Skynet. And then, the third phase of that then is
terrifying.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But then the third phase of that is then the orchestration of all of those agents together, and then allowing for a more thoughtful approach to it. So that is newer in general in the industry, and we have a number of customers that have been playing with this in a small little areas where they have a couple of different agents and things. But we think this is why we're investing in developing our own platform for Agentic AI. Is we think this is the future, right? So if you paid attention to like Gartner's RPA, a hyper automation story that you hear about for the last several years. I mean, this is, I don't know what's above hyper, like Uber automation, but this is kind of that next step that's really going to make, I think, RPA scale out across the industry more so than it already has.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting times ahead. I feel like it's hard to imagine, what kind of world we'll be living in 2-3 years' time. It's fascinating and scary to think about all at the same time. I'd like to talk about like how to prioritize efforts really through a business lens, right? So how do you help organizations go from let's automate everything to a more thoughtful, focused and prioritized strategy that will actually work long-term?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, and this applies to more than just automation, right? I mean, you got to eat the elephant one bite at a time. We usually start with that lean value analysis. So, and we don't do it for every process. We'll ask the customer, pick a process you think could benefit from automation. And if you don't have one, we'll help you come up with one, right? Usually provisioning is a good start because a lot of people think they could benefit from it, but they also don't think they can justify it. And so we will sit down with the customer, it's usually a couple-hour workshop, and say, okay, let's talk through this process, starting from the beginning, identify each task, how long it takes to do the work, how long it takes to wait between those tasks, how often you have to redo those tasks because of errors or issues and that kind of thing. And then we have a tool we built that maps all that out, and we'll show you this is what your cost was to do this, right, in human hours, translated by pay and all that. This is what you're spending in effort to do a manual task. And then this is what it would look like if we automated it, how much faster it would be, how much less wait time there would be, and all that. And we're confident generally when we put those things on paper that we can do it. If we don't think the use case can be easily automated, we'll tell the customer that too and say it doesn't make sense to do this. But most things can be automated. So start there. And then if that one process is like, yeah, okay, there's a return here where we didn't think there was, that's a good indicator that you should start doing that analysis on all of your processes. In fact, we've had customers where we'll go in and do a free workshop to identify a process and analyze it. And afterwards, they've come up to us and said, okay, now we want to pay you to do this for like all of our processes in this department because this is a great approach. And that starts to generate a lot of goodwill with the leadership team as well, because they understand that this is a thoughtful approach as opposed to just something that sounds cool and technical. But when you have, say, a list of processes, right? The way we analyze that, and when you were looking at more than one thing you could potentially automate, is kind of like Gartner Magic Quadrant, right? You have an x-axis that's going to be, all the way left is low value to the business, all the way right is high value to the business. And then you're going to have a y-axis where, at 0.0, it's going to be really difficult to automate and complex. And at the top of that y-axis, it's going to be super easy to automate.
Heavy lift, low lift. Yeah.
You got it. And then what ends up in that top right quadrant is all your high value, easy to implement processes. And you could choose to start there. You could choose to start something that's low value and more complex to get a good sense of what more complex looks like. But that helps people then put something objectively on paper that they can use as a method to prioritize what they want to do. Mm-hmm. Then you start small, right? And that's why I usually recommend take the easy to accomplish high value use case and go with that one. because you start small, you quickly automate that, you show value back to the business, right?
Yeah.
So here's the before, here's the after. Now let me do this with the rest of these processes, right? And then again, you have to make sure as an IT team, you understand your business needs, right? If the business, and this is very common, to have the business say, well, we're not worried about the speed of this. Like, we get things fast enough. That's not a problem. Therefore, we don't need automation. If you're focused on trying to speed up a process when your business is saying, we're actually getting things fast enough, we just want it to be more reliable, right? Your business is not going to necessarily resonate with what you want to do. So understand where the real challenges are in the business. If it's consistency, errors, if error reduction, security is a hot one that probably should be on everybody's radar, right? And align, again, those use cases and what you're automating to the things that are going to provide the best business value, and that you're framing automation projects and initiatives within that business lens, as opposed to, just what you think you're getting out of it. And then, again, finally, on the larger companies, make sure you have a dedicated enterprise automation architecture team that can help stitch all this together and do the prioritization, et cetera. Because if you don't, you're just going to have, 10 people in a room with 12 different ways that they want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked about buy-in earlier, that if you don't have leadership buy-in, it's going to fail, right? So what have you learned about the culture of automation, especially when it comes to getting buy-in from both leadership and IT teams?
Yeah, with leadership, it's generally the IT leaders are somewhat agnostic about automation, but it's not usually something they're thinking about, right? They're not getting orders from the CIO to go automate everything. They're just being told to do things better, more efficiently, and so on. And even though automation is one way of doing that, they think in terms of different solutions, right? Once they can see a process and see it dissected and see what it's really costing them and how much time it's really taking and how often they have to redo it, and then they can see where automation would fix that, that usually is like a light switch for a leadership team, and they'll buy into it. We've, again, number of customers that say, we only deploy, 10 VMs a month. This isn't going to do anything for us. And intuitively, I would probably agree and say that's a low number. But when we dig into the process and understand how complex it is, and really they're actually redoing it 2 or 3 times because it's the things they're deploying are more complex and so on, right? When we start to paint that picture that it's more than just the speed, and you're actually spending a lot of time and effort on this, and that translates into dollars, and we can map that out and put it on paper, that makes the change happen. I think it's different with IT. There are still a lot of people in IT that are afraid automation is going to make their job go away, right? They feel like if I'm not doing this, then they won't need me anymore. The other thing is, sometimes I've actually had some IT people tell me they like doing the things that would be automated. They enjoy clicking the buttons and doing the work, and that's understandable. I too like doing things like that sometimes. But in reality, the lack of automating is probably what's going to make your job go away before automation would, right?
Yeah.
Because a company can't afford to keep everybody on board and growing at the rate they are without automation. And
not on this day.
Yeah, no. And the other thing too, and again, this doesn't always align with IT people's interests, but I look at it as an opportunity if you're in IT. And when we kind of talk to folks about this, a lot of times this will resonate and change minds as well. But instead of thinking of yourself as the person who goes and does the work, think of yourself as the person who, builds the factory that does the work. So you're programming little robots, or virtual robots, whatever you want to call it, to go perform some work, and that becomes your job. It's a skill set improvement. You still need to understand all the technology underneath that you're automating, because you have to do it right. But you're also learning now how to do a little bit of development, a little bit of scripting, interfacing with REST APIs, automating your environment, and it's just going to grow you as a professional, as opposed to, put your job at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you were talking about automation as like a lifestyle or living system. So it's always ongoing. So the need for someone to orchestrate that is always going to be there, especially as the business grows and shifts. There's different things to think about automating.
That's right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And different technologies will come out, and you'll think, hey, this is a better way of doing it. We're going to do it this way from now on. And There's plenty of work to do. It's different work than maybe what you're used to doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then with AI, that adds a whole additional layer, right? So
Yeah.
the sky's the limit right now.
Actually, you bring a good point up. I think AI could, if used properly, could really help people do this, especially the ones that don't want to do it because they don't have the skills, right? I don't know how to write scripts. I don't know how to develop. AI can code for you, right? You can ask it to create workflows on every popular platform out there and get good usable code back from it as a starting point. So I think it's just going to speed up the ability to automate use cases within environments, and it's going to help support
100%.
people that don't have the skills.
Yeah. Our CTO is definitely excited about that. He used AI to build something like low or no code the other night. We're building some sales enablement automation and AI for our clients. And he basically let his AI team do the work while he went to sleep. And when he woke up in the morning, it was built. So that was really cool.
That's great. Yeah.
So for IT leaders really just getting started, what are the early signals or metrics that show automation is actually working?
Yeah, I think, you got to measure, obviously. The easiest thing to measure, I think, is provisioning time if you've automated your provisioning process. So a lot of times you'll have a ticketing system that will, give you a nice report that says request received at this day and time and completed at this day and time. And you can look at that shrink, right? And you can show the before and the after very easily. And you can show the business like, hey, look, you can take on more now because we're not spending as much time on this. So that's obviously the easiest one to do. And then, if your consistency was your main goal, right, so that you can reduce errors and things, you can show that, right? If you look at the average ticket volume for issues with non-automated systems versus automated systems and measure the difference, right? Because oftentimes what we'll see, we've had customers tell us this, that they saw up to 50% or more drop in tickets on systems after they automated them because they didn't have the issues that they had before where they forgot to do a thing or whatever. I mean, take the most basic thing that I think most people have automated out there, if they haven't already. They should, is like password resets, right? And I worked at a financial services company. We had 30% of our call volume, I think, was password resets. We had a little bit of a more strict password policy, and somebody at the help desk had to walk the user through it, identify them, authenticate them, and so on, and then do it. And then we said, all right, this is too much. Let's just put this online. We'll give everybody self-service to reset their own passwords. Automated that process and saw call volume drop in our help desk by 30%, which means we didn't need to hire 3 people with the next acquisition that we did, right? We could get by with what we had. Yeah. So those, some things are kind of obvious, some aren't, but longer term trends you could look at would be, what was your hiring rate for IT professionals that manage infrastructure systems, pre and post automation, once you have a system in place that's doing it at scale, right? But it's really the before and after snapshots. You won't feel it as much unless you're actually in the seat doing the work, and then you'll find that you have a lot more time than you did before. So it's easy for individuals to measure individual contributor benefit. From a leadership perspective, that you really got to measure it. Yeah,
that makes sense. And I would also add to that. I mean, although this is not as measurable, I think team and leadership sentiment also counts. Like, are they spending more time on strategic work? Are they being more proactive? Because those could be success indicators too. I mean, at least from my perspective, I'm a non-technical leader, and those things matter to me.
Absolutely, and it matters a lot too when bad things happen, right? If you are in a situation where you need to recover because you had a data center outage, tornado, hurricane, whatever. Manually doing that, you're almost guaranteed to miss your SLOs, your SLAs for recovery, right? It's impossible, especially if the issue impacted your staff and they're not able to connect for whatever reason. Automated recovery, and where you orchestrate and you factor in system dependencies so that you order startups properly and all of that, is the only way you can achieve your business goals in a lot of cases, right? And it becomes blatantly obvious, folks who have automation versus those who don't, when there's a major disaster.
Yeah. So Finally, what's one small, meaningful action an IT leader could take this week to move forward, even just a little bit, with more intelligent automation without the overwhelm?
I think there's a few things they can do that are pretty easy, right? Mm-hmm. One is talk to your teams, figure out what's out there. I had some entertaining automation discussions with customers where I had individual contributors in the room with their managers, the manager saying, we need to do more automation. We need to get more effective and efficient here, and asked me to come in and present. And before I got two words out of my mouth, the individual contributor spoke up and said, wait a minute, we're already doing this. And the manager's like, wait, what, you are? I didn't know that. And I got to watch real time as they learned about what's going on in their own IT organization, which was fun. But it was also good that they were automating. But the point is, like, you may not know it. You already might have a lot of this out there. Mm-hmm. You may have a couple of these gurus who are just scripting everything and you didn't know it to begin with. So figure that out. I identify where that stuff's at. What do you have currently? And is it all in, a common platform, common approach? Are there differences? Is there a way to standardize that? The second thing is, once you go through that process, even if you don't have anything, start encouraging people to automate, right? Even little bits and pieces of things. And the reason you do that is there may be a time when that automation solves a problem quickly, brings something up in a time crunch and saves everybody time, right? And you're not going to know when that happens, but when it does, you can point to it and say, look, automation did this for us. We took the time to automate this process and this is the result. Give us the time and resources to do more, right?
Yeah.
Then the last thing would be, don't be shy. Get a third party. I wouldn't, if you bring in an automation software company to talk about it, of course they're going to tell you need it right now and go buy. And that's just the way the industry works. It's understandable. But bring in consultants who've been there, who've done this at scale, and get third-party validation. Because a lot of times, third parties will have tools like the lean value thing we created that we can help customers use so that they can do analysis and try to figure it out from scratch. If they've done automation in the past as a third party, then they're going to have code they can reuse. It's likely going to fit your environment with minute changes, right? So you're starting kind of one step ahead by reusing what's out there. And, get it. So if you do all of those things, right, start to identify what you have, encourage building new, and then get a third party in to help you build that story, right? Those are things as leadership you can do right now. And then take that up the chain, right, to get higher level sponsorship when you start to see some of the wins.
Yeah, that's great advice. Chris, thank you so much for joining us and really for bringing such grounded, tactical clarity to a topic I feel like is often buried in buzzwords. And if you're an IT leader listening right now and you're feeling the pressure to modernize but still stuck in firefighting mode, you're not alone. Automation isn't just a technical tool, it's a strategic unlock, but one, when it's deployed with intention, leadership buy-in, and a real plan to scale. And that's what today's conversation was all about. So I hope it gave you a few sparks to take back to your team. And if you're ready to explore automation solutions that actually work in the real world, head to technologymatch.com. You could sign in to access your dashboard or sign up in seconds if you're new. And then just go to the search bar or to the chat bot. Our little chatbot Cosmo in the corner, and just search Advizex automation in the search bar, and you'll find Chris's automation solutions, vetted insights, everything you need to evaluate, fit, and take next steps. And Chris, if someone wants to connect with you directly, what's the best way to do that?
Probably the best way is email and cmiller@advizex.com, and that's ADVIZEX.
Yep, and I will put that in the show notes as well. Thanks for being with us.